The mind behind the weapon, the Madsen LMG and the Visionaries who invented mobile firepower. The workshop smelled of gun oil and winter cold, the kind that seeped through Copenhagen's industrial waterfront walls, no matter how many coal stoves burned in the corners. It was late November 1896, and Julius Andreas Rasmussen stood at his workbench with calloused hands wrapped around something the military establishment insisted couldn't exist. A machine gun light enough for one man to carry, reliable enough to fire through battlefield conditions, radical enough to rewrite what firepower meant. The metal skeleton weighed less than 20 pounds. Beside him, Theodore Skoubo adjusted a tiny spring with jeweler's precision, his fingers moving with the confidence of a craftsman who'd spent 30 years making impossibly small parts fit impossibly tight tolerances. Through the frosted window, November light caught the curves of the overhead magazine they'd designed, a shape that looked alien compared to the belt-fed monsters every army in Europe worshipped. "If it feeds properly," Skoubo said quietly, "we'll have proven half the colonels wrong in one afternoon." Rasmussen didn't answer immediately. He was 41 years old, a naval officer turned inventor, and he'd learned from the sea that sometimes the most elegant solutions looked fragile until you understood the physics beneath them. He lifted the prototype, feeling its balance, the way the long recoil mechanism distributed forces that would shatter a conventional weapon this light. Somewhere in Denmark's military offices, procurement officials were reviewing requests for more Maxim guns, 200-pound behemoths that required four-man crews and wheeled carriages. They couldn't imagine what Rasmussen held in his hands, firepower that moved with the soldier, that turned suppression into something portable, something revolutionary. The problem wasn't theoretical. Across Africa and Asia, European armies were discovering the brutal limitation of their doctrine. Colonial wars moved fast, across terrain where heavy machine guns became anchors instead of assets. When native forces used speed and geography, machine gun crews found themselves outflanked, their weapons too cumbersome to reposition, too slow to keep pace with infantry advance. Reports came back to Copenhagen regularly, engagements where firepower sat useless on hillsides while infantry advanced without support, where the promise of automatic fire died because it couldn't move. Rasmussen had read every after-action report Denmark's military published. He'd seen the pattern everyone else refused to acknowledge. Mobility was becoming more valuable than raw weight of fire. "The Danish army trials are in 2 weeks, Skoubo reminded him, wiping metal filings from the feed mechanism. "They'll bring colonels who've never questioned why machine guns have to be heavy. Then we'll show them numbers they can't ignore," Rasmussen answered. But even as he said it, doubt moved beneath his certainty like tide beneath a ship's hull. What if the mechanism jammed? What if the overhead magazine, the design feature Skoubo had insisted would work, failed in front of observers who already believed lighter weapons meant weaker weapons? The Danish military wasn't known for embracing innovation that contradicted established thinking. They'd built their doctrine around Prussian models, mass, weight, defensive firepower. A 20-pound machine gun felt like a violation of natural law to men who'd been taught that suppressive fire required bulk. Rasmussen had come to this obsession through bitter experience. Years earlier, during winter naval exercises off Denmark's coast, he'd watched sailors struggle to mount a Maxim gun on deck during a storm. The weapon's 200-pound mass made it nearly useless in rapid response scenarios. That night, sketching by candlelight in his quarters, the question had crystallized. What if the problem wasn't that machine guns needed to be heavy, but that everyone had stopped questioning why they were? What if you inverted the mechanism, used a long recoil system where the barrel moved backward with each shot, cushioning force instead of fighting it? The idea seemed insane to conventional engineering. But the sea had taught Rasmussen that sometimes the most stable solutions looked counterintuitive, until you understood the forces involved. Skoubo had been the missing piece. The civilian gunsmith operated from a workshop that smelled of tobacco and precision grinding, where lathes sang through steel and hand tools carved tolerances smaller than a human hair. Where Rasmussen brought tactical vision, Scubo brought obsessive craftsmanship. The overhead magazine, criticized before anyone tested it, was his insight. Curved, gravity-fed, it allowed a prone shooter to maintain a low silhouette while ammunition fed smoothly downward. It looked wrong to eyes trained on belt-fed systems, but physics didn't care about aesthetics. Outside, Copenhagen's winter afternoon faded toward evening. In 2 weeks, they'd faced Danish army colonels who'd already decided machine guns belonged on carriages, not shoulders. Rasmussen set the prototype down carefully, watching light catch the machined surfaces Scubo had polished to mirror brightness. Somewhere in the Empire's colonial holdings, soldiers were dying because firepower couldn't keep pace with tactics. Somewhere, doctrine was killing men because it couldn't imagine warfare differently. "We'll show them it works," Scubo said, as if reading his thought. "That's all we can do." Rasmussen nodded. But he knew showing wasn't the same as convincing. Not when you were asking the military establishment to abandon everything they believed about the relationship between weight and power, about what machine guns were supposed to be. If stories like this make you question what you'd do when everyone says you're wrong, but you know you're right, tell us in the comments. And stay with us for the next chapters. How long can you keep building something when the people who need it most refuse to see its value? The strategic crisis was everywhere and nowhere, invisible to generals who measured firepower in pounds of steel, undeniable to junior officers returning from colonial frontiers with casualties that didn't match the victory reports. By the 1890s, European armies had perfected the art of defensive firepower. The Maxim gun, introduced in 1884, could fire 500 rounds per minute from a fixed position. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, it was an anchor. Every colonial engagement told the same story. Machine guns dominated when they could be positioned and supplied, but positioning them required wagons, crews, advanced preparation. When engagements became fluid, when the enemy refused to attack prepared defensive lines, the weapons that promised dominance became expensive monuments to strategic blindness. Julius Andreas Rasmussen had grown up understanding that sometimes the sea taught lessons the classroom refused. Born in Copenhagen's naval district in 1855, he'd spent his childhood watching ship mechanics solve problems through observation rather than doctrine. His father had been a naval engineer, a man who believed machinery existed to serve human needs, not the other way around. The lesson stuck. When Rasmussen entered Denmark's naval officer training program, he carried that craftsman's perspective into a world that valued rank and tradition over innovation. His early career was unremarkable. Coastal patrol duties, routine maintenance oversight, the slow rhythm of peacetime naval service. But he noticed things other officers ignored. He noticed that weapons systems designed for naval combat often failed when sailors needed to deploy them rapidly. He noticed that weight, the supposed measure of a weapon's seriousness, often became its fatal weakness in real conditions. The defining moment came during winter exercises in 1892. Rasmussen was 37, a lieutenant commander assigned to a destroyer conducting storm weather drills. The scenario was simple: mount defensive weapons while maintaining speed in rough seas. The crew struggled with a deck-mounted Maxim, its bulk making it nearly impossible to position safely in rolling swells. Rasmussen watched 3 sailors nearly swept overboard trying to secure a weapon that, in theory, gave the destroyer overwhelming firepower. That night, unable to sleep as the ship pitched through North Sea darkness, he kept returning to a single question: why did automatic fire require so much mass? The conventional answer was recoil management. A machine gun, firing 500 rounds per minute, generated enormous backward force. Traditional engineering absorbed this through heavy frames, massive bolt assemblies, spring systems that turned the weapon into a small artillery piece. But Rasmussen understood from naval mechanics that recoil could be managed differently. What if instead of fighting the barrel's backward motion, you used it? What if the barrel itself moved backward with each shot, cushioning the force through a longer travel distance? It would require precision engineering, tight tolerances, perfectly balanced springs, a feed system that could accommodate barrel movement. It would produce a weapon that looked impossibly delicate to eyes trained on conventional designs. It would also, Rasmussen calculated in the margins of his duty logs, allow a machine gun to weigh less than 25 pounds. He spent the next 4 years refining the concept in his limited free time, sketching mechanisms in notebooks that filled with cross-sectional diagrams and force calculations. But Rasmussen wasn't a gunsmith. He understood principles, not the microscopic tolerances that turned theory into working metal. In 1896, through connections in Copenhagen's industrial community, he was introduced to Theodor Schober, a civilian craftsman whose workshop specialized in custom firearms and precision repairs. Schober was everything Rasmussen wasn't. Patient where Rasmussen was driven, obsessively detail-focused where Rasmussen worked in broad concepts, content with the quiet satisfaction of perfect craftsmanship where Rasmussen burned with the need to solve problems no one else acknowledged. He was 53 when they met, his hands scarred from decades of metalwork, his workshop a cathedral of lathes and files where tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. When Rasmussen explained his vision, a machine gun light enough to carry, using barrel recoil as a feature rather than a problem, Schober didn't laugh. He studied the sketches in silence, then said, "This requires manufacturing precision Denmark's military suppliers don't have. They make bulk weapons. This needs art. Can you do it?" Rasmussen asked. Schober looked at him with the flat honesty of a man who'd spent 30 years making impossible requests possible. "If you accept that it will take 2 years and cost more than the army wants to pay, yes." They began work in November 1896. The partnership was immediate and strange. The naval officer with tactical vision and no patience for tedious refinement. The craftsman with infinite patience and no interest in military doctrine. Rasmussen would arrive at Schober's workshop after naval duties, often after dark, and they'd work by lamplight testing feed mechanisms, adjusting spring tensions, filing parts until they fit together with the precision of watch components. Schober insisted on building 3 prototypes simultaneously, testing different variations of the same core concept. Rasmussen insisted on field-realistic testing, dragging prototypes through Copenhagen's winter slush, deliberately fouling mechanisms with mud and sand, firing until barrels glowed red to identify failure points. By early 1898, they had something that worked. The Madsen, named for Denmark's Minister of War, who'd provided minimal development funding, weighed 18 pounds unloaded, less than a third the weight of a Maxim. Its long recoil system allowed the barrel to travel backward, nearly half an inch with each shot, spreading recoil forces across a longer duration and gentler curve. The overhead magazine, curved and gravity-fed, held 25 rounds and allowed prone firing without the weapon's profile rising above cover. It looked wrong, too light, too slim, too unconventional, to eyes trained on belt-fed behemoths. In March 1898, they requested formal Danish army trials. The response came in writing, cold and bureaucratic. The proposed weapon does not conform to established standards for suppressive fire systems, present for preliminary observation only. Preliminary observation meant skepticism dressed in official language. It meant colonels who'd already decided the weapon couldn't work. What do you do when the system says your solution is impossible, but you're holding the working proof in your hands? The trial took place on a grey April morning at Hærens Materielkommando, Denmark's military procurement facility outside Copenhagen. Rasmussen and Skubo arrived at dawn, the Madsen prototype wrapped in canvas in the back of a hired cart. Rasmussen wore his naval dress uniform, calculated formality. Skubo wore his workshop clothes, refusing the suggestion that he dress for officers. They'd tested the weapon 2 days prior, firing 200 rounds without failure. The mechanism worked. The question was whether doctrine would allow itself to see proof. The observation panel consisted of 3 colonels and a major from Denmark's infantry command. They stood at a covered review station while Rasmussen set up the weapon on a firing stand designed for rifles, not machine guns. The Madsen looked absurdly small next to the range's resident Maxim, which sat on its wheeled carriage like a monument to conventional thinking. Rasmussen explained the mechanism: long recoil operation, overhead magazine feed, designed for mobile infantry support, while the colonels watched with the polite skepticism of men listening to a sales pitch they'd already decided to refuse. 18 pounds, the senior colonel said, hefting the weapon. He was a large man, his uniform decorated with medals from colonial service. How does something this light manage recoil forces that require 200-pound frames? The barrel moves backward with each shot, Rasmussen explained, distributing force across distance rather than absorbing it through mass. The principle, the colonel interrupted, is that machine guns are suppressive fire weapons. They hold defensive positions. They don't dance around battlefields. Rasmussen felt the familiar weight of institutional resistance, the doctrine that couldn't imagine warfare differently. Beside him, Skubo stood silent, his craftsman's hands folded, waiting for the demonstration that would speak louder than explanations. If we could demonstrate the firing sequence, Rasmussen said carefully. The major, younger, his uniform less decorated, nodded toward the range. 25 rounds. Let's see what it does. Rasmussen loaded the overhead magazine, feeling the weight of scrutiny heavier than the weapon itself. He'd fired this prototype hundreds of times. He knew its rhythm, its recoil pulse, the reliable click of its feed mechanism. But knowing and proving were different things, especially when the observers wanted failure. He squeezed the trigger. The Madsen fired with a sound different from the Maxim's heavy hammering, lighter, faster, a stuttering bark rather than a roar. The barrel cycled backward and forward with each shot, the long recoil system absorbing forces that would have torn apart a lighter frame. 25 rounds downrange in less than 4 seconds. Empty magazine. Rasmussen set the weapon down carefully, the barrel hot but the frame steady. Silence from the review station. Then, impressive rate of fire, the major admitted, but that magazine design will jam in field conditions, the senior colonel finished. Gravity feed doesn't work when soldiers are moving, diving, fighting. This might function on a test range. Combat is different. Rasmussen had prepared for this objection. He reloaded, then deliberately tilted the weapon at harsh angles while firing. Left, right, nearly vertical. The magazine fed smoothly through every position. 25 more rounds, 0 malfunctions. He looked at the colonels, waiting for acknowledgement that what they'd just witnessed contradicted their assumptions. A toy, the senior colonel said finally. He walked toward the weapon, and in that moment Rasmussen saw something shift in his expression. Not respect, but something worse. Fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of advocating for innovation that failed. Fear of the career risk in supporting a weapon that contradicted everything Denmark's military doctrine taught about suppressive fire. Machine guns hold ground, the colonel continued. They don't skip around battlefields like oversized rifles. This, he gestured at the Madsen with dismissive finality, this is mechanically interesting, but it's not serious warfare. The panel filed away. No formal rejection, no acceptance. Just the cold bureaucratic silence that meant, we've decided, and your demonstration changed nothing. Back in Skubo's workshop that evening, Rasmussen sat on a stool while the craftsman cleaned the prototype with methodical care, removing range dust from every surface. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, "They're afraid," Scubo said quietly, "not of the weapon failing, of it succeeding and proving them obsolete." Rasmussen understood. He'd seen it before, the institutional reflex that killed innovation not through honest evaluation, but through the deeper terror of change. If the Madsen worked, it meant Denmark's doctrine was wrong. It meant millions spent on heavy machine guns represented strategic blindness. It meant younger officers like the Major at the trials might start questioning whether other sacred assumptions were equally hollow. "We continue," Rasmussen said. "With what support?" "None. We continue anyway." Over the following months, they refined the design with obsessive incrementalism. Scubo replaced springs that worked well enough with springs machined to tighter tolerances. Rasmussen tested feed systems through 300 consecutive rounds, documenting every hesitation and adjustment. They couldn't convince Denmark's regular army, but there were other paths. Colonial forces, naval landing parties, units that operated in conditions where mobility mattered more than doctrine. Rasmussen began writing directly to officers serving in Greenland, in Denmark's Caribbean colonies, anywhere soldiers faced tactical problems that conventional weapons couldn't solve. One response came back that changed everything. A lieutenant stationed in Danish West Indies described combat against local resistance fighters who used jungle terrain to outflank Danish positions. "Heavy machine guns," he wrote, "sat useless on hillsides while engagements happened in vegetation that would trap a wheeled carriage in minutes. We need firepower that moves with the squad. Can your weapon do that?" Rasmussen read the letter 3 times. Then he packaged a Madsen prototype and shipped it to the Caribbean, along with 500 rounds of ammunition and detailed operational notes. 3 months later, the lieutenant's report arrived. The weapon had been used in 4 engagements. It performed flawlessly in humidity that rusted conventional firearms overnight. Its lightweight allowed 2-man operation, 1 shooter, 1 ammunition bearer, through jungle terrain. In one firefight, the ability to reposition suppressive fire every few minutes had prevented a flank collapse that would have cost 12 casualties. At the bottom of the report, the lieutenant had written, "I don't care what doctrine says. This weapon saves lives. Send more." Rasmussen brought the report to Heron's Material Commando. The response was a purchase order for 50 units, not for line infantry, but for colonial forces and naval detachments. Limited adoption, token acknowledgement. But it was production. It was proof turning into metal. Scubo hired 3 additional craftsmen. Rasmussen arranged manufacturing space in Copenhagen's industrial waterfront. By 1902, they delivered 75 Madsen guns to Danish forces. And something unexpected happened. Word spread, not through official channels, but through the international network of military observers, foreign attachés, officers who attended firing demonstrations and recognized tactical revolution when they saw it. Do you think you'd fight the system for what you believe works, or accept what doctrine says is impossible? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real innovation stories from history. When the first soldiers tell you your weapon works, but the generals still call it a toy, which voices do you listen to? The international breakthrough came from the East, from a place Rasmussen had never imagined his weapon would prove its value. In late 1903, tension between Russia and Japan escalated toward war over Manchuria and Korea. Russian military procurement officers, watching European firearms development with the intensity of a nation preparing for major conflict, attended a firing demonstration in Copenhagen. They watched the Madsen perform. They asked technical questions Scubo answered with craftsman's precision. They purchased 30 units for field testing. Rasmussen didn't hear about the weapon's performance until spring 1904, when the Russo-Japanese War exploded across Manchuria's frozen landscape. By then, Russian forces had distributed Madsen guns to forward units as experimental supplements to standard Maxim positions. The reports that filtered back to Copenhagen read like vindication, written in combat statistics. In the trenches at Port Arthur, where winter temperatures dropped to -20°C, Maxim guns seized from cold-induced failures. The Madsen, with its simpler mechanism and long recoil system that generated less thermal stress, continued firing. Russian infantry officers reported something conventional doctrine insisted was impossible: a machine gun that infantry squads could reposition during combat, establishing suppressive fire from forward positions within minutes of reaching new ground. One report, translated and forwarded through Denmark's military attaché in St. Petersburg, described an engagement near Mukden. A Russian company faced Japanese assault across open ground. Traditional defensive doctrine called for pre-positioned Maxim guns at fixed points, but the Madsen-equipped squad had moved forward with the infantry, establishing covering fire from a position 300 meters ahead of the main line, close enough that suppressive fire kept Japanese troops pinned while Russian artillery adjusted range. The Japanese intelligence officer who wrote the after-action report expressed confusion. Russian troops achieved fire concentration from positions that appeared too exposed for machine gun emplacements. Unknown weapon type, highly portable, rate of fire approximately 450 rounds per minute. Scubo read the reports in his workshop, oil-stained fingers tracing the translated lines. He looked at Rasmussen with something approaching wonder. They're doing exactly what you said: mobile firepower. They're rewriting tactics because the weapon allows it. But Rasmussen was already thinking 3 steps ahead. If the Madsen proved decisive in major power warfare, European armies would have to acknowledge their doctrinal blindness. Britain, France, Germany, the military establishments that had dismissed Danish innovation, would see Russian combat effectiveness and understand that mobility multiplied firepower's value beyond anything weight of fire alone could achieve. The response, when it came, was worse than rejection. It was systematic denial. In 1905, as the Russo-Japanese War concluded with Russia's shocking defeat, military analysts across Europe studied every aspect of the conflict. They analyzed tactics, logistics, naval operations, artillery coordination, and when they addressed machine gun effectiveness, they performed extraordinary mental gymnastics to avoid the obvious conclusion. German military publications acknowledged that auxiliary automatic weapons had shown some utility in certain limited scenarios. British observers noted that machine gun doctrine remained primarily defensive. French analysis focused on the Maxim's continued dominance in fixed positions, treating mobile weapons as tactical curiosities. The deliberate blindness was most obvious in Germany's exhaustive 1908 testing program. The Heereswaffenamt, Germany's Army Weapons Office, put the Madsen through the most rigorous evaluation any firearm had faced. They tested it in 15 different categories: accuracy, rate of fire, reliability under temperature extremes, ease of maintenance, resistance to fouling, durability during sustained fire, effectiveness from prone, kneeling and standing positions, performance after submersion, performance after prolonged storage, jam recovery procedures, ammunition compatibility, component interchangeability, training time required for operator proficiency, and maintenance burden for armorer personnel. The Madsen outperformed the standard Maxim in 13 categories. The German report documented every advantage with clinical precision. Then, in the final procurement recommendation, the Weapons Office concluded, while technically impressive, the Madsen system presents logistical integration challenges that outweigh tactical advantages. Recommend continued focus on established Maxim platforms. Rasmussen obtained a copy of the German report through military channels. He read it in his Copenhagen apartment, and for the first time since beginning this obsession, felt something close to despair. The numbers didn't lie. 13 categories of superior performance. But procurement decided that superior performance mattered less than bureaucratic convenience, that lives lost because firepower couldn't move mattered less than avoiding supply chain adjustments. "They proved us right," Rasmussen said to Schubo, and rejected the proof. The pattern repeated across Europe. France tested the Madsen in 1909, documented its reliability and portability, then purchased 300 Hotchkiss heavy machine guns instead. Britain conducted trials in 1910, noted the weapon's innovative design, then expanded production of Vickers guns. Every major power acknowledged the Madsen's technical achievement while refusing to admit that their doctrine was obsolete. But smaller nations, countries without entrenched military bureaucracies, without the pride of empire, saw opportunity. Norway adopted the Madsen for its mountain troops in 1906. Portugal ordered units for colonial forces in 1907. By 1910, 22 countries had purchased the weapon: Mexico, Brazil, Siam, Netherlands, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Persia, Ethiopia, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, plus Denmark's expanded orders. These weren't the powers that defined military doctrine. They were nations that needed weapons that worked more than weapons that validated established thinking. Rasmussen tracked each adoption, each combat report, each tactical innovation the Madsen enabled. In mountain warfare, Norwegian troops established suppressive fire from positions wheeled carriages couldn't reach. In jungle operations, Portuguese colonial forces adapted fire and movement tactics that wouldn't have been possible with 200-pound weapons. In South American border conflicts, both sides discovered that mobile firepower changed the fundamental calculus of infantry combat. And through it all, Europe's major powers maintained their studied ignorance. The weapon that had proven its revolutionary concept in combat across 3 continents remained technically interesting but tactically marginal in the minds of the generals who would soon command World War I. The personal cost deepened, with each validation followed by institutional rejection. Rasmussen was 53 in 1908, promoted to commander in Denmark's navy, but increasingly exhausted by the psychological toll of being proven right while being treated as irrelevant. Schubo, 65, continued refining the weapon with obsessive precision, as if perfect engineering could overcome strategic stupidity. They'd achieved commercial success, production contracts, international sales, technical recognition, but the vindication they'd imagined, the moment when Europe's military establishment would acknowledge their revolution, never arrived. "We changed warfare," Schubo said one evening in 1912, watching one of his apprentices assemble Madsen components for a Portuguese order. 22 armies carry our weapon. But the armies that matter still pretend we don't exist. Rasmussen had no answer. He'd learned from the sea that sometimes you could be absolutely right about the forces beneath the surface, and still watch ships run aground because captains trusted tradition over charts. If you invented something that worked better than what everyone used, but they bought it anyway just to prove you didn't matter, would that feel like success or erasure? The telegram arrived at Schubo's workshop on August 5, 1914, 3 days after Germany invaded Belgium, and Europe descended into the war everyone had predicted, but no one had prepared for properly. It came from a Danish military liaison in Berlin, 3 sentences that would validate everything and prove nothing in time. German forward units report encountering Madsen-armed Belgian forces. Unexpected mobile fire superiority causing tactical adjustments. Recommend priority assessment. Rasmussen read it standing at Schubo's workbench, the summer heat making Copenhagen's industrial waterfront smell of hot metal and coal smoke. World War I was 4 days old, and already the weapon Europe's major powers had dismissed as technically interesting but tactically marginal was forcing the German army to adjust tactics. But the vindication was complex, bitter, too late to matter the way it should have. Belgium had purchased Madsen guns for its colonial forces in Congo. When Germany invaded, some of those weapons were in Belgian arsenals, distributed to fortress troops and rearguard units. They weren't doctrine. They weren't planned. They were the few dozen examples of a weapon system the Belgian military had considered auxiliary at best. And yet, in the opening days of fighting, German after-action reports mentioned them repeatedly, encountered unexpected mobile automatic fire from forward positions, squad-level suppressive fire from locations unsuitable for heavy machine guns, rapid repositioning of fire support elements. Over the following months, as trench warfare consumed Europe and millions died in the grinding attrition that defined the Western Front, the tactical landscape validated everything Rasmussen and Skobø had argued for 2 decades. The war became a contest of mobile firepower and rapid position adjustment. Heavy machine guns, magnificent in defensive positions, proved catastrophically limited when infantry needed to advance under fire. Armies began desperate development of lighter automatic weapons, France's Chauchat, Britain's Lewis gun, America's Browning automatic rifle. Each design borrowed, directly or indirectly, from principles the Madsen had pioneered. The weapon that invented the light machine gun category became overshadowed by its descendants. Denmark's industrial capacity couldn't scale production to meet wartime demand. The Madsen's complex mechanism, brilliant for reliability but expensive to manufacture, made it less attractive than simpler, cheaper designs rushed into production under desperate timelines. German forces purchased several thousand Madsen guns from neutral suppliers, particularly for Stoßtruppen assault units that needed portable firepower. Austrian forces used them extensively. Russian orders continued even as their military collapsed toward revolution. But the weapon that had proven mobile firepower's revolution became a footnote in the story of weapons it had inspired. Rasmussen followed the war through technical journals, intelligence summaries, and the quiet correspondence network of military observers who appreciated what they were witnessing. Every tactical innovation validated his 20-year-old insight. Firepower unchained from mass became the foundation of modern infantry tactics. Squad automatic weapons, fire and movement doctrine, suppressive fire as a mobile element rather than fixed position. These weren't radical ideas anymore. They were survival necessities written in casualties across the Western Front. In October 1917, already ill with the pneumonia that would kill him within weeks, Rasmussen wrote a final letter to Theodor Skobø. It was found among his personal effects after his death at age 62, before the war's end, before the full vindication of concepts he'd sacrificed 2 decades to prove. We were right about what needed to exist. History will acknowledge that, eventually. But I wonder if being right early is a kind of curse. You see the future clearly enough to build it, but not clearly enough to make others see it before circumstances force them to. How many soldiers died in this war because doctrine moved slower than necessity? I don't have the mathematics for that calculation. I don't want to. Skobø read the letter at Rasmussen's funeral, a small service in Copenhagen, attended by a handful of naval officers and workshop apprentices. No military honors, no recognition from the establishment that had dismissed their innovation as impractical. Just a craftsman eulogizing an inventor who'd understood warfare's future while generals clung to its past. But the Madsen itself continued, indifferent to its creator's death or recognition. Production extended through the 1920s and 30s. Finland adopted it for the Winter War against Soviet invasion. Germany used captured units in World War II. Norwegian resistance fighters carried them in mountain operations. By 1945, 34 nations had adopted the weapon in some capacity. When production finally ceased in 1955, the Madsen had seen 53 years of continuous combat service, one of the longest operational lifespans of any automatic weapon in military history. The irony was perfect and terrible. The weapon dismissed as too light, too unconventional, too different from established doctrine, outlasted nearly every heavy machine gun that had been preferred over it. It fought in World War I, the Russian Civil War, World War II, the Chinese Civil War, the Korean War, and dozens of smaller conflicts across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Guerrilla forces prized it for reliability in harsh conditions. Irregular armies valued its portability. Conventional forces slowly, grudgingly acknowledged that Rasmussen and Skoubo had been right about mobile firepower's tactical revolution. But by then, the inventors were gone. Rasmussen died in 1917. Skoubo continued production until his death in 1923, still refining tolerances, still improving feed mechanisms, still perfecting a weapon the world had finally accepted without ever properly acknowledging the minds that created it. The post-war analysis came slowly in military journals and tactical studies that traced the evolution of infantry doctrine. Historians noted that the light machine gun, portable automatic fire at squad level, had fundamentally altered combat. They documented how World War I forced every major power to develop weapons matching capabilities the Madsen had demonstrated in 1902. They acknowledged in footnotes and technical appendices that Danish innovation had pioneered concepts that became foundational to modern warfare. But recognition and remembrance weren't the same thing. The Lewis gun became famous through British service. The bar became legendary through American use. The Madsen became a historical curiosity, technically important, tactically significant, but never quite achieving the cultural resonance of the weapons it had inspired and in many ways made possible. What does it mean to change the world if the world forgets to say your name when it tells the story? The Tøjhus Museet, Copenhagen's Arsenal Museum, sits near the waterfront where Skoubo's workshop once stood, though the building itself is long gone, replaced by shipping offices and tourist cafes. Inside the museum's firearms gallery, under careful climate control and museum lighting, one of the original 1902 Madsen prototypes rests in a glass display case. The metal has aged to soft grey, the overhead magazine frozen in its distinctive curved geometry, the long recoil mechanism visible through a cutaway that reveals the elegant complexity Rasmussen and Skoubo spent 6 years perfecting. Most visitors pass it without pausing, their attention drawn to more famous weapons, to guns whose names carried the weight of cultural memory rather than just technical significance. But sometimes a veteran stops. Sometimes a military historian recognizes what they're seeing. Sometimes a firearms enthusiast reads the placard and understands they're looking at the weapon that invented a category, that proved mobile firepower could exist decades before doctrine allowed itself to believe it. The placard text is brief, museum-neutral, carefully factual, Madsen light machine gun, Rekylgewehr M 1902. Designed by Julius A. Rasmussen and Theodor Skoubo. Denmark, 1896-1902. Weight, 9 kilo, 19. 8 lbs. Rate of fire, 450 rounds, minute. Production, 1902-1955, adopted by 34 nations. What the placard doesn't say, what museum text can never quite capture, is the cost encoded in those dates. 23 years between the first rejection and Rasmussen's death. 34 years between the first prototype and Skoubo's death. 53 years of production proving a concept that Europe's military establishment spent 2 decades refusing to acknowledge. The museum doesn't display the rejection letters, the skeptical procurement reports, the combat statistics that validated innovation while generals insisted doctrine knew better. The long-term consequences rippled through military thought in ways that took decades to fully recognize. Post-World War II analysis confirmed that the light machine gun, squad-level automatic fire, portable suppression, mobile firepower, had become fundamental to infantry doctrine across every modern military. The tactical revolution Rasmussen envisioned in 1892 became so thoroughly integrated into warfare that younger officers couldn't imagine combat without it. Fire and movement, squad suppressive fire, automatic weapons as standard infantry equipment, These were axioms now, as obvious as the need for reliable rifles or accurate artillery. But the path from innovation to axiom had been brutal. Historians could calculate roughly how many casualties in World War I resulted from the lag between tactical necessity and doctrinal acceptance. How many soldiers advanced without adequate suppressive fire because their armies considered mobile machine guns auxiliary rather than essential? How many died in no man's land because firepower remained chained to defensive positions, unable to move with infantry assault? The mathematics were imprecise, but the direction was clear. Institutional resistance to innovation had a body count. The second major twist came in the 1960s, during decolonization conflicts across Africa and Asia. Madsen guns, some dating to pre-World War I production, appeared in the hands of guerrilla forces and irregular armies. They were obsolete by modern standards, outperformed by Cold War designs, lacking the refinements of post-1945 engineering. But they still worked. After 60 years, after passing through multiple wars and owners and storage conditions that would have destroyed lesser weapons, Madsen guns continued firing. The reliability Scubo had obsessed over, the precision engineering that made the weapon expensive in 1902, proved its value across 3 generations of conflict. Military procurement officers in the 1960s, analyzing battlefield reports from former colonies, sometimes encountered references to Danish machine guns and needed archival research to understand what their field units were reporting. The Madsen had become so thoroughly historical that contemporary officers didn't recognize it. The weapon that invented mobile firepower had outlived its inventors, its doctrine, and its fame. The third and final twist was quieter, academic, the kind of recognition that comes too late to matter to the people who needed it. In the 1970s and 80s, military historians began systematic reappraisal of early automatic weapons development. They traced the evolution of light machine guns back through the Bar, the Chauchat, the Lewis, the Hotchkiss portable variants, all the World War I emergency developments, and kept finding references to Danish innovation. The Madsen hadn't just pioneered mobile firepower. It had proven the concept was viable, had demonstrated the engineering solutions that later designs borrowed, had shown that weight wasn't destiny for automatic weapons. One historian, writing in 1987, concluded, "The Madsen's historical significance lies not in its tactical dominance, but in its doctrinal revelation." Rasmussen and Scubo proved that machine guns could be portable before any military establishment was willing to believe it. They paid the inventor's price, being right too early, seeing the future clearly enough to build it, but not clearly enough to make others see it before casualties forced acknowledgement. The burden Rasmussen carried, the psychological weight of knowing soldiers died because innovation moved slower than necessity, never lifted. His final letter to Scubo suggested he understood that being vindicated by history was different from being heard by the people who needed to listen. He died before the war's end, before the universal adoption of light machine guns, before the military establishment finally admitted that Danish craftsmen in a Copenhagen workshop had understood infantry warfare's future better than all of Europe's generals combined. Scubo outlived his partner by 6 years, continuing production, still refining tolerances that were already tighter than any competitor could match. His workshop apprentices remembered him as a man who rarely spoke about recognition or credit, who seemed to find sufficient satisfaction in the click of a perfectly adjusted feed mechanism, the smooth cycling of a barrel that moved exactly as physics and engineering dictated it should. But they also remembered moments when he'd pause, holding a completed Madsen, and say quietly, "Julie would have wanted to see this one." The balance is perfect. The museum display doesn't capture those moments. It can't. What remains is the weapon itself, cold metal and frozen mechanism, a prototype that became an archetype, the invention that proved mobile firepower could exist decades before doctrine allowed itself to imagine it. Visitors pass it daily, rarely pausing, unaware they're looking at the answer to a question most people don't know was ever controversial. Can firepower move with the soldier, or must it remain anchored to defensive doctrine? Julius Andreas Rasmussen was only a naval officer who refused to accept that machine guns had to be heavy. Theodore Scubo was only a craftsman who believed precision engineering could solve problems doctrine insisted were unsolvable. Together, for 6 years in a Copenhagen workshop while the 19th century died and the 20th century prepared for industrial slaughter, they held the future of infantry warfare in their calloused hands. The Madsen LMG didn't become famous. It became foundational, the weapon that invented a concept, proved a revolution, and then watched as later designs claimed the recognition for ideas it had pioneered. In the end, what endured wasn't the weapon itself, gradually replaced by modern successors. What endured was the truth its inventors dared to articulate when everyone said they were wrong, that firepower, liberated from weight and doctrine, could move with the soldier, could adapt to terrain and circumstance, could become not just a force multiplier, but the foundation of how infantry fights. The museum's climate control hums softly, preserving metal that saw battles across 6 decades and 5 continents. The curved magazine still catches the light, just as it did in 1896, when Scubo first filed it to perfect tolerances. The long recoil mechanism, visible through the cutaway, still shows the elegant solution to a problem conventional wisdom said had no answer. If this story reminded you that changing the world often means being right before anyone believes you, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. When the weapon you invented outlives your recognition, becomes so fundamental that people forget it was once revolutionary, is that the ultimate vindication or the cruelest obscurity?